Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. In the ancient world, where mortals walked beneath the gaze of immortal gods, few stories capture the devastating beauty of love between the divine and human, quite like the tale of Zeus and Semele. This is not a story of happily ever after. This is a story of passion that burns too bright, of love that consumes, of desires that lead to destruction. It's a romance that begins with divine infatuation and ends in flames, yet somehow transcends death itself to become one of mythology's most profound narratives about sacrifice, redemption, and the unbearable price of glimpsing the face of divinity. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Thebes, that legendary city rising from the plains of Boeotia, its white marble temples catching the golden Mediterranean sun. The air shimmers with heat and incense smoke from countless altars where citizens make their daily offerings to the gods. Among these temples stands one particularly sacred to Zeus, the king of the gods, lord of sky and thunder, whose power none dare challenge. It is here, in this very temple, that our story begins with a young princess performing her sacred duties, unaware that she is being watched by eyes that have witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. Semele was extraordinary in ways that transcended mere physical beauty, though by all accounts she possessed that in abundance. She was the youngest daughter of King Cadmus, the legendary founder of Thebes, and Queen Harmonia, herself a goddess, the daughter of Ares, god of war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Through her veins ran both mortal and divine blood, making her something rare and precious, caught between two worlds, yet fully belonging to neither. Her name, scholars tell us, derives from an ancient word meaning earth, a fitting designation for one who would become the bridge between mortality and divinity, between the terrestrial and the celestial. As a princess of Thebes, Semele lived a life of privilege, but it was not a life of idleness. She had been trained since childhood in the sacred rites, learning the proper prayers, the correct rituals, the ancient songs that pleased the gods. She knew which flowers to weave into garlands for different deities, which wines to pour at which altars, which incense to burn for which purposes. But more than her technical knowledge, Semele possessed something that could not be taught: a genuine devotion, a sincere reverence that made her worship feel personal rather than merely dutiful. When she performed the rites at Zeus's temple, she did so with her whole heart, speaking to the god as if he were present, as if he could hear her individual voice among the thousands that called to him daily. And on one fateful day, he did hear her, he did see her, and everything changed. The day began like any other sacred day in Thebes. Semele rose before dawn, bathed in water drawn fresh from the spring sacred to the nymphs, and dressed in her ceremonial robes, white linen, so fine it seemed to glow in the early morning light. She adorned her dark hair with flowers, laurel, and myrtle, and wore simple jewelry that caught the light without being ostentatious. Her attendants helped her prepare the sacrifice, a magnificent bull, perfect and unblemished, its horns gilded for the occasion. This was no small offering. Bulls were expensive, reserved for the most important ceremonies, and this one had been raised specifically for this purpose, fed on the finest grain, treated with the respect due to a sacred animal. The procession to the temple moved slowly through the awakening city, priests chanting hymns, musicians playing flutes and lyres, citizens gathering to watch and add their prayers to those being offered. Semele walked with quiet dignity, her mind focused on the ritual ahead, on performing every gesture perfectly, on honoring Zeus in the way he deserved. At the temple's great altar, she spoke the ancient words, her voice clear and melodious, carrying across the courtyard. With the ritual knife, she made the sacred cut, and the bull's blood flowed into the channels carved into the altar stone, an offering of life to the god of life and death. What Semele did not know, what she could not have known, was that at that very moment, Zeus himself was watching from Olympus, his divine gaze drawn to this particular ceremony among the countless thousands performed in his name that day. Some say it was the sincerity in her voice that first caught his attention. Others claim it was the grace of her movements, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the curve of her neck as she bent to perform the rites. Still, others whisper that it was simply fate, that this moment had been written in the stars since before Semele's birth, that some loves are destined even when they are doomed. After the sacrifice was complete, after the prayers had been offered, and the ceremonial portions burned, Semele walked to the banks of the Asopus River to perform the ritual cleansing. The river ran cold and clear, fed by mountain springs, and its waters were said to have purifying properties. She removed her blood-stained ceremonial robes and waded into the shallows, letting the current wash away the physical evidence of the sacrifice while she spoke quiet prayers of gratitude to the river god who allowed her to use his waters. Zeus, watching from above, felt something he had not experienced in ages, a genuine stirring of his immortal heart. This was not mere lust, though desire certainly played its part. This was something deeper, more complex. He saw in Semele a purity of spirit, a devotion that was becoming rare even among the gods. He saw beauty, yes, but also intelligence in her eyes, strength in her bearing, a quiet dignity that seemed almost divine in its quality. He saw someone who deserved to be loved by a god. And in that moment of weakness, or perhaps it was strength, Zeus decided that he would be that god. But Zeus was not fool enough to appear to Semele in his true form. Not yet. He knew what had happened to mortals who looked upon the gods unveiled, their minds shattered, their bodies unable to contain the divine radiance, their very mortality burning away like morning mist before the sun. No, he would court her as mortals courted each other, taking on human form, presenting himself as a man, albeit an extraordinarily handsome and charismatic one. He would win her heart before revealing his true nature. And perhaps by then, she would be ready. That evening, as Semele returned to the palace, she encountered a stranger on the road. He was tall and powerfully built, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and experience far beyond any mortal man. His voice, when he spoke, resonated in her chest like distant thunder. He asked directions to the palace, claimed to be a traveler seeking hospitality from the king. There was something about him that made Semele's heart race, though she could not have said why. She offered to escort him to her father's hall, and as they walked together, they talked. And in that conversation, something ignited between them. Zeus, in his mortal guise, was charm itself. He told her stories of distant lands, described wonders she had only heard about in songs, made her laugh with clever observations about human nature. He asked about her life, her duties, her dreams, and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. By the time they reached the palace, Semele found herself hoping this stranger would stay, that she would have more opportunities to speak with him, to hear his voice, to feel this strange stirring in her chest that she was only beginning to recognize as attraction. Cadmus, as was the custom, offered hospitality to the traveler. A guest was sacred, protected by Zeus himself, and no king would dare turn away someone seeking shelter. The stranger was given quarters in the palace, invited to dine with the royal family, treated with the honor due to a nobleman, for his bearing suggested high birth. And over the following days and weeks, this mysterious visitor became a fixture in Thebes, and more specifically, in Semele's life. Their courtship, if it can be called that, unfolded with the slow inevitability of summer turning to autumn. They would meet in the palace gardens, ostensibly by chance, but increasingly by design. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, finding in each other a kind of understanding that neither had experienced before. Zeus, who had lived for eons, found himself genuinely delighted by Semele's fresh perspective, her mortal wisdom, her ability to find wonder in things he had long taken for granted. Semele, for her part, felt seen and understood in a way she never had before, felt valued not just for her royal blood or her beauty, but for her mind, her spirit, her essential self. The first kiss happened in the moonlit garden, beneath a fig tree heavy with fruit. Zeus had been describing the constellations, pointing out patterns in the stars, and Semele had laughed at one of his stories about the gods. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the space between them disappeared. The kiss was electric, sending shivers through Semele's entire body, making her feel as if she were standing at the edge of a great precipice, about to fall into something vast and unknown. Zeus, for his part, felt that familiar rush of triumph mixed with something unfamiliar, a tenderness, a desire not just to possess, but to protect, to cherish. They became lovers in the way that young lovers do, stealing moments together, finding excuses to be in the same room, developing their own private language of looks and gestures. Zeus continued to maintain his mortal disguise, though he dropped hints about his true nature, cryptic comments about the gods, knowledge he should not possess, an authority in his manner that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Semele noticed these things, but attributed them to his being a nobleman, perhaps even royalty from some foreign land. She did not suspect, could not have imagined, that she was lying in the arms of the king of the gods himself. Their physical union was transcendent in ways that Semele struggled to articulate. It was not merely pleasure, though there was certainly that. It was a feeling of completeness, of touching something vast and eternal, of being more than herself. Zeus, careful to maintain his mortal form, nonetheless could not entirely suppress his divine nature. When they made love, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. Flowers bloomed out of season. Wine in nearby amphorae grew sweeter. And sometimes, if Semele was paying attention, she could see hints of lightning flickering in the depths of his eyes. Months passed in this blissful state. Semele had never been happier. She walked through the palace as if floating, her face perpetually lit with joy. Her sisters noticed and teased her about her mysterious lover. Her father noticed and was pleased that his youngest daughter had found happiness. And Semele herself, caught up in the intoxicating rush of first love, barely noticed the subtle changes in her body that marked the beginning of pregnancy. When she finally realized she was carrying a child, Semele's emotions were complex. There was joy, certainly the joy of impending motherhood, the wonder of new life growing inside her. But there was also fear, for her lover had not yet formally asked Cadmus for her hand, had not made their relationship official. She was a princess, and princesses were expected to marry before bearing children. The social implications could be severe, potentially scandalous. She needed to tell her lover, needed to know his intentions, needed to understand where their relationship was headed. When she told Zeus, he still had not revealed his true identity. He reacted with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of him was pleased. A child, even a half-mortal child, was something precious. But part of him was concerned. He knew how Hera would react when she discovered this liaison, and he knew that Semele and the unborn child would be in danger. He redoubled his efforts to keep their affair secret, visiting Semele only at night, instructing her to tell no one about the child's father, promising that he would protect her, but offering no details about how. This should have been Semele's first warning that something was wrong. A nobleman, even a foreign prince, would not need to be so secretive. He would proudly claim his child, would formalize the union, would bring honor to both families. But love, especially young love, is often blind to warning signs. Semele trusted her lover, believed in his promises, convinced herself that he had good reasons for his caution, even if those reasons remained mysterious. But secrets, especially divine secrets, have a way of getting out. And high on Olympus, Zeus's wife, the goddess Hera, queen of the gods and patroness of marriage, was about to discover her husband's latest infidelity. To understand what happened next, one must understand Hera. She was not simply a jealous wife, though jealousy certainly played its part. She was a goddess whose very essence was tied to the sanctity of marriage, to the bonds of matrimony, to the idea that unions were sacred and inviolable. Every time Zeus had an affair, it was not merely a personal betrayal, it was an assault on everything Hera represented, a cosmic insult to her divine domain. And Zeus had many, many affairs. Over the centuries, Hera had developed a reputation for vengeance that struck terror into the hearts of Zeus's lovers and their offspring. She had turned women into animals, driven them to madness, killed their children, ensured that their lives became exercises in suffering. She could not punish Zeus directly. He was too powerful. And besides, as king of the gods, he seemed to believe himself above such mortal concepts as marital fidelity. So Hera directed her considerable anger and creativity toward those she could reach, toward the mortal women who caught her husband's wandering eye, and toward the children born of those unions. Hera learned of Semele's pregnancy through the network of spies and informants that any powerful goddess maintains. Perhaps it was a slip by one of Zeus's companions. Perhaps it was simply divine intuition, a sense that her husband was once again betraying her. However it happened, once Hera knew, her wrath was terrible to behold. The other gods on Olympus trembled when they saw the cold fury in her eyes, the dangerous calm in her voice. They knew that look. It meant someone was about to suffer. But Hera was nothing if not patient and clever. She could have struck Semele down with a thought, could have sent plague or madness or 100 other divine punishments. But that would have been too quick, too merciful. No, Hera wanted Semele to be the instrument of her own destruction. She wanted to arrange things so that Zeus himself would be responsible for his lover's death. The irony, the cruel poetry of it, appealed to her sense of justice. So Hera descended to Thebes, wrapped in disguise as only a goddess can be. She took the form of an old woman, a crone bent with age, her face wrinkled, her voice quavering. She positioned herself as Beroe, Semele's former wet nurse, the woman who had cared for her as an infant, someone Semele would trust implicitly, whose advice she would take as coming from a place of love and concern. The disguised goddess contrived to encounter Semele in the palace gardens, the same gardens where the princess had first kissed her mysterious lover. The reunion was emotional. Semele had not seen her old nurse in years, and she welcomed her with genuine joy, invited her to stay at the palace, insisted that they spend time together, catching up. Hera, playing her role perfectly, seemed delighted to be reunited with her former charge. And over the following days, the two women became constant companions. Hera, as Beroe, was the picture of kind concern. She fussed over Semele's pregnancy, offering advice about herbs and diet, sharing folk wisdom about ensuring a healthy birth. She asked about the father, and Semele, trusting this woman she had known since childhood, confided in her. She told Beroe about her lover, about his mysterious nature, about how he claimed to be someone important, but would not reveal his identity. She even admitted, in a whisper, that he had claimed to be Zeus himself. This was the moment Hera had been waiting for. With perfect timing, she reacted with disbelief. "Zeus?" the false nurse scoffed. "My dear child, I worry that this man is deceiving you. Many men claim to be gods to seduce innocent girls. How can you be sure he is who he claims to be? Has he given you any proof?" The seed of doubt was planted. Semele defended her lover, insisted that he must be telling the truth, pointed to the strange phenomena that occurred when they were together. But Beroe continued to express skepticism, gentle at first, then growing more insistent. "If he truly is Zeus," the old nurse said, "then surely he would not object to proving it. The gods appear to each other in their true forms. Does he appear to you as he appears to Hera? Or does he hide himself, keeping you in the dark, like a common mistress, rather than honoring you as a queen should be honored?" Day after day, Hera, in her disguise, worked on Semele's mind, undermining her confidence, making her question what she had accepted on faith. The goddess knew human psychology intimately, understood how pride could be manipulated, how love could be turned into doubt. She spoke to Semele's dignity, suggested that if her lover truly respected her, truly loved her, he would be willing to reveal himself fully. She planted the idea that Semele deserved no less than what Hera herself received, that anything less was an insult to Semele's worth. Finally, after weeks of this psychological manipulation, Hera delivered her masterstroke. "You must make him prove himself," she urged. "Ask him to grant you a wish, any wish, sworn on the river Styx, and then ask him to appear before you as he truly is, in all his glory, just as he appears to his divine wife. If he refuses, you will know he is a fraud. If he agrees, you will know the truth, and you will have your proof. It is only fair, my dear. You carry his child. You deserve honesty." The oath on the river Styx was no small thing. In the divine realm, such an oath was absolutely binding, unbreakable even by Zeus himself. To swear on the Styx was to place oneself under a compulsion that transcended divine will. The river itself, ancient and terrible, would enforce the oath, and the consequences of breaking such a vow were catastrophic. Hera knew this. She was counting on it. Semele, her mind now filled with doubt and wounded pride, decided to follow her old nurse's advice. The next time her lover came to her, she would ask for this proof. She would demand to see him as he truly was. It seemed reasonable, even modest. If he loved her, if he respected her, surely he would not refuse such a simple request. And if he did refuse, then perhaps Beroe was right. Perhaps he was merely a clever man taking advantage of a naive princess. Zeus came to her that night, as he had on so many nights before, slipping into her chambers after the palace had gone to sleep. He found Semele waiting for him, and something in her expression immediately put him on alert. There was a determination in her eyes, a set to her jaw that he had not seen before. She did not come into his arms as she usually did. Instead, she stood across the room, her hands folded over her swelling belly, and regarded him with an expression that was almost challenging. "I have a request," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Before we speak of anything else, I want you to swear an oath." Zeus felt the first stirrings of unease. "What kind of oath?" he asked carefully. "Swear on the river Styx that you will grant me one wish, anything I desire, without question or hesitation." The alarm bells in Zeus's divine mind were ringing loudly now. This was not like Semele. Someone had been talking to her, manipulating her. He could sense his wife's interference, like a bad smell in the air. But he was trapped. To refuse would confirm Semele's doubts, would damage the relationship, perhaps irreparably. And he did love her, in his way. He wanted to give her what she asked for, wanted to prove his devotion. How bad could one wish be? "Very well," he said, and spoke the ancient words that bound him irrevocably. "By the river Styx, by its dark waters and eternal flow, I swear that I will grant you any wish you name. Let the river hold me to account if I fail in this." The words echoed with power, reverberating through dimensions mortals could not perceive. The oath was sealed. Whatever Semele asked for, Zeus would be compelled to provide. Semele took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. "I wish to see you as you truly are," she said. "Not in this mortal disguise, not hidden behind flesh and limitation. I want to see you as the gods see you, in your full divine glory. Show me Zeus, king of the gods, lord of sky and storm, in all his terrible magnificence." Zeus felt his divine heart sink. Of all the wishes she might have made, this was the worst possible one. He knew instantly that Hera had orchestrated this, had whispered poisoned words in Semele's ear, had maneuvered her into making this specific request, He tried to dissuade her, his voice urgent, almost pleading. Semele, my love, you do not know what you ask. My true form is not meant for mortal eyes. To look upon me unveiled is to look upon the heart of lightning itself, upon power that mortals cannot comprehend or survive. Please ask for anything else. Immortality for yourself, divine status for our child, wealth beyond measure, wisdom beyond mortal ken. Anything but this. Please. But Semele, her mind clouded by Hera's manipulations, her pride wounded by months of secrecy, her heart heavy with doubt, stood firm. You swore an oath, she said. An oath on the sticks. You cannot refuse. I want to see you as you truly are. Zeus tried one more time. Semele, if you truly love me, if you care for our child, reconsider this wish. I am begging you. What you ask will destroy you. Then perhaps you are not Zeus after all, Semele said, echoing Beroe's words. Perhaps my nurse was right, and you are merely a clever impostor using divine pretenses to seduce a foolish princess. It was a trap beautifully constructed. If he refused, he proved himself a liar, and Semele would turn from him, convinced she had been deceived. If he complied, she would die. Either way, Hera won. Zeus, bound by his oath, feeling the compulsion of the sticks pulling at his divine essence, had no choice. So be it, he said, his voice heavy with sorrow and regret. May the gods forgive me for what I am about to do. May you forgive me. But most of all, may I someday forgive myself. He stepped back from her, and his mortal disguise began to burn away like morning mist before the sun. The man that Semele had known disappeared, and in his place stood something that mortal eyes were never meant to witness. Zeus, in his true form, was not a being of flesh and blood, but of elemental power, of forces that predated humanity, of energies that had shaped the cosmos itself. The air in the chamber began to crackle with electricity. The smell of ozone filled the room. Light began to emanate from Zeus's form, not the gentle light of lamps or candles, but the harsh, terrible radiance of lightning made manifest. His body seemed to contain storm systems. His eyes held the depth of the sky. His presence filled the room like a thunderclap fills a valley. This was Zeus Olympian, Zeus Thunderer, Zeus King of gods and men, and the sight of him was more than any mortal frame could bear. Semele's first instinct was to look away, but she found she could not. there was a terrible beauty to what she was seeing, a magnificence that transcended mere appearance. This was her lover, the father of her child, revealed in his full divine majesty. And for one brief, shining moment, she understood. She understood why the gods did not walk among mortals in their true forms, why they maintained disguises, why some knowledge was too great for mortal minds to contain. She was looking at the face of divinity itself, and it was glorious and terrible in equal measure. But the human body was not designed to perceive such things. Semele's eyes, struggling to process what they were seeing, felt as if they were burning. Her skin, in proximity to such concentrated divine energy, began to blister and smoke. The very air she was breathing seemed to catch fire in her lungs. Every cell in her body screamed in protest against the divine radiance filling the room. Zeus, horror dawning on his face as he realized what was happening, tried to dampen his divine essence, to tone down the radiance, but it was too late. The damage had already begun. Semele's mortal frame, unable to contain the experience of witnessing unveiled divinity, was burning from the inside out. She fell to her knees, her mouth opening in a scream that never came. Flames, divine fire, the same radiance that emanated from Zeus's form, erupted from her skin. Her hair caught fire, her clothes ignited, and within moments she was engulfed. The pain, Zeus knew, must be unbearable, but it would be mercifully brief. No mortal could survive this. Semele, princess of Thebes, priestess of Zeus, mother of his unborn child, was dying before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room was filled with a terrible brightness, and then suddenly it was over. Where Semele had stood was only ash, scattered across the floor, still smoldering. The acrid smell of burned flesh filled the chamber, and in the silence that followed, Zeus, king of gods, ruler of Olympus, controller of storms and lightning, fell to his knees and wept. His grief was a terrible thing. Thunder rumbled across Thebes. Lightning struck randomly, setting fires throughout the city. Rain began to fall, torrential downpours, as if the sky itself were weeping. The entire palace shook with the force of Zeus's anguish. He had killed her. His oath, his divine nature, his very essence had destroyed the woman he loved, and there was no undoing it. Semele was gone, consumed by the very divinity she had demanded to see. But even in his grief, Zeus's divine senses picked up something small and resilient, struggling to survive amid the ashes of its mother. The child. Their child. Somehow, impossibly, the developing fetus had survived Semele's incineration. Perhaps it was divine blood, diluted though it was, that protected it. Perhaps it was Zeus's own subconscious effort to shield it. Perhaps it was simply fate, the will of the fates themselves, for this child had a destiny to fulfill. Zeus, moving with supernatural speed, reached into the ashes and flames and retrieved the tiny form. It was barely developed, far too premature to survive on its own, but it was alive, its small heart beating with stubborn persistence. Zeus, thinking quickly, did something that no god had ever done before. Using his divine power, he cut open his own thigh and placed the fetus inside, sealing the wound with his essence. The child would gestate there, protected by Zeus's immortal flesh, nurtured by his divine blood, until it was ready to be born. As the wound closed and the child settled into this strange new womb, Zeus stood in the ruins of Semele's chamber, surrounded by her ashes, and made a vow. He would protect this child, would ensure its survival, would see it grow to adulthood and claim its place as a god. And someday, somehow, he would find a way to honor Semele's memory, to give her the immortality she should have had, to make right this terrible wrong. But for now, all he could do was gather her ashes carefully, placing them in a golden urn, and carry them to Olympus for safekeeping. And as he left Thebes that night, still disguised to mortal eyes, but carrying within his own body the child that should have been born from Semele's womb, the storm began to clear, leaving behind a city in shock and a family in mourning. King Cadmus, discovering his daughter's death, was devastated. Semele's sisters, Ino, Autonoe, and Agave, publicly claimed that she had lied about Zeus being her lover, that she had been killed by divine lightning as punishment for blasphemy, for falsely claiming association with the King of Gods. This narrative, while painful, was easier for the family to accept than the truth that their beloved Semele had been destroyed by the very god she loved, that her death was the result of both divine oath and divine jealousy. The months that followed were difficult for Zeus in ways he had not anticipated. Carrying the developing child in his thigh was uncomfortable, often painful, a constant reminder of what he had lost. But he endured it, seeing it as a small penance for his role in Semele's death. He kept the pregnancy secret from most of Olympus, especially from Hera, who assumed that with Semele's death, the problematic situation had been resolved. The child grew, developing in its strange womb, nurtured by divine essence in ways no mortal child had ever been. And when the time finally came for the birth, Zeus felt labor pains as real as any mortal woman might experience. He retreated to a remote part of Olympus, surrounded by trusted attendants. And when his thigh split open to release the fully developed infant, the cry that rang out was not of pain, but of triumph. The child was a boy, perfect and beautiful, with a hint of horns on his forehead and eyes that seemed to contain wisdom beyond his moments of life. Zeus named him Dionysus, which some translate as twice born or Zeus born, a name that acknowledged his extraordinary entry into the world. The baby had been born first from his mother's womb and second from his father's thigh, making him unique among all of creation. Truly, a child of both mortality and divinity. Zeus held his newborn son and saw Semele's features in his face, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his mouth. The sight filled him with equal measures of joy and sorrow. This child was all he had left of the woman he had loved and lost, a living reminder of both their passion and its terrible consequences. But Zeus knew that Dionysus could not stay on Olympus, not yet. Hera would eventually discover the child's existence, and her wrath would be terrible. So Zeus entrusted the infant to Hermes, his messenger, with instructions to take the baby to the mortal realm and find safe keepers. Hermes, in turn, brought Dionysus to Semele's sister Ino and her husband Athamas, convincing them to raise the child in secret, disguised as a girl to avoid Hera's attention. But Hera was not so easily fooled. Eventually, she discovered the deception and punished Ino and Athamas with madness, forcing Zeus to intervene once again. He transformed Dionysus into a baby goat and entrusted him to the nymphs of Mount Nysa, where the child was raised in secret, far from Olympian politics and divine jealousies. There, surrounded by nymphs and satyrs, nourished by the wild natural world, Dionysus grew up learning the mysteries of nature, the secrets of the vine, and the power of transformation. As Dionysus matured, he began to understand his own nature, to grasp the significance of his dual heritage. He learned of his mother's fate, of how she had died carrying him, of how his father had saved him through extraordinary means. And as he learned these things, as he contemplated the tragedy that had marked his conception and birth, something began to grow within him, a determination, a purpose, a plan. Dionysus became the god of wine. Yes, but he was also the god of revelry, of ecstasy, of transformation and rebirth. These domains were not arbitrary. They reflected his own nature, his own story. Wine transforms grapes, pressing and fermenting them into something new. Revelry transforms consciousness, taking mortals outside their ordinary experience. Ecstasy transforms emotion, lifting the spirit beyond normal bounds. And rebirth? Well, rebirth was what Dionysus knew better than anyone. He had been born twice, had experienced death and renewal in the most literal sense possible. As the young god came into his power, discovering the extent of his abilities, he began to develop a following. Mortals found him compelling in ways they could not quite articulate. There was something wild about him, something that promised liberation from the constraints of civilized life. His worship involved dance and music, wine and altered consciousness, a temporary escape from the everyday world into something more primal and authentic. Women, particularly, were drawn to his cult, finding in his rites a freedom they were denied in conventional society. These women, his followers, became known as Maenads or Bacchantes, and their ecstatic worship of Dionysus would become legendary. But even as Dionysus built his cult, even as he traveled the world, spreading his mysteries and gaining worshippers, one thing haunted him above all else: the fate of his mother. Semele had died, giving him the chance to be born, had sacrificed everything so that he could exist. And now she languished in the underworld, a shade among shades, stripped of the life and vitality that had defined her, denied the divinity that should have been her birthright as the mother of a god. This was unacceptable to Dionysus. His mother had died because of the machinations of Hera and the nature of Zeus's divinity. She had died for loving a god, for carrying his child, for daring to ask to see the truth. That was not justice. That was cruelty. And while Dionysus could not undo her death, could not turn back time to prevent the tragedy, he could do something else. He could bring her back. The journey to the underworld was not something undertaken lightly, even by a god. The realm of Hades was separate from both Olympus and the mortal world, existing in a dimension of shadow and memory, where the dead gathered according to their deeds in life. To enter the underworld while still living, still possessing divine vitality, was to risk becoming trapped there, for the realm itself resisted intrusions by the living. Many heroes had attempted the descent, and few had succeeded. But Dionysus was determined, and he possessed advantages that mortal heroes did not. The god prepared carefully for his journey. he brought with him gifts for Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld, wine from the finest vines, naturally, but also other offerings that showed respect and understanding of their domain. He also brought something more valuable than any physical gift: his genuine love for his mother, and his willingness to take on any challenge, face any danger, to bring her back. The entrance to the underworld that Dionysus chose was at Lerna, near Thebes, a place sacred to his family. The swamp there was said to connect to the rivers of the underworld, and local tradition held that certain rituals performed at the water's edge could open a path for those brave or foolish enough to attempt the descent. Dionysus stood at the swamp's edge as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and spoke the ancient words that would open the way. The water before him began to swirl, forming a vortex that led down into darkness. Cold air rushed up from the opening, carrying with it the smell of earth and stone, and something else, something indefinable that marked it as belonging to a realm beyond life. Dionysus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to attempt, and stepped forward into the void. The descent was disorienting. Dionysus felt himself falling through layers of reality, passing through veils that separated the living world from the realm of the dead. The temperature dropped dramatically. The light faded to a dim, sourceless glow that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. And then, suddenly, he was standing on solid ground again, his feet on the banks of the river Styx, that ancient waterway that formed the boundary between life and death. Before him stretched the underworld in all its melancholy grandeur. It was not the place of torture and fire that later traditions would imagine. Instead, it was a realm of shadows and echoes, where the dead existed in a pale imitation of life, their forms translucent, their voices faint, their memories slowly fading into the eternal twilight. In the distance, Dionysus could see the palaces of Hades and Persephone, dark towers that rose against the dim sky like accusations. The journey to those palaces took Dionysus past the various regions of the underworld. He walked through the asphodel meadows, where ordinary souls wandered in a daze, neither happy nor sad, simply existing in their shadowy half-life. He skirted the edges of Tartarus, where the wicked suffered punishments suited to their crimes, where the air itself seemed heavy with guilt and regret. And he passed by the Elysian fields, where the heroic and virtuous dwelt in a state as close to happiness as the dead could achieve. Throughout his journey, the shades of the dead watched him pass with wonder and longing. Here was a living god, radiating vitality and divine power, a reminder of everything they had lost. Some reached out to him with translucent hands, hoping to touch something real, something alive. Dionysus felt their desperation, their hunger for life, and it strengthened his resolve. His mother should not be here, should not be reduced to this pale existence. When he finally reached the palace of Hades, he found the god of the dead waiting for him. Hades was tall and severe, with eyes that had witnessed every death since the beginning of time. He regarded Dionysus with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "It is rare that the living come to my realm," Hades said, his voice echoing like a door closing on a tomb. "Rarer still that they come seeking something other than their own return. What brings you here, son of Zeus?" Dionysus bowed respectfully. Despite his divine status, he was in Hades's domain now, and protocol mattered. "Lord Hades, I have come to request the release of a soul. My mother, Semele, who died through no fault of her own, who was destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. I wish to bring her back to the world above, to restore to her the life that was stolen." Hades regarded him thoughtfully. "Your mother's death was tragic, certainly. But death is the natural end of mortal life. All who live must eventually come here. To release her would be to violate the natural order, to set a precedent that could unravel the very foundations of existence. Why should I grant this request?" This was the moment Dionysus had been preparing for. "Because," he said, "my mother was killed by her association with the gods. She died because she loved Zeus and bore his child. Her death was a consequence of divine politics, of Hera's jealousy, of forces far beyond mortal control. She should never have died at all. Moreover, she is the mother of a god. When I claimed my divine status, when Zeus acknowledged me as one of the Olympians, my mother became the mother of divinity. That should grant her some special consideration, some exception to the usual rules." Hades considered this argument. It was not without merit. The mothers of gods typically were goddesses themselves, immortal beings who never had to face the prospect of death. Semele was unique in being a mortal who had given birth to divinity. Perhaps that did warrant special treatment. But there was still the question of precedent. If Hades allowed one soul to return simply because they had divine connections, where would it end? Every god who had ever loved a mortal would come demanding their lover's return. The underworld would become a revolving door, and death would lose its meaning. No, there had to be conditions, tests, something to ensure that this was truly exceptional rather than a new norm. "Very well," Hades said finally. I will allow you to take your mother back to the world above on one condition. You must find her yourself among all the countless dead who dwell in my realm. I will not guide you. I will not help you. You must locate her shade, recognize her among the millions of forgotten faces, and bring her to me. If you can do this, I will release her. If you cannot, you must leave empty-handed and never return to make this request again. Do we have an agreement? Dionysus agreed without hesitation. He had his mother's face burned into his memory, knew her features from the descriptions his father had given him, from the few images that had been preserved in Thebes before her family disowned her memory. He would find her, no matter how long it took, no matter how many shades he had to examine. And so began a search that would test even a god's patience and determination. Dionysus walked through the vast expanse of the underworld, examining shade after shade, looking into translucent faces, searching for the one that belonged to his mother. The dead, curious about this living God in their midst, gathered around him, each hoping, perhaps, that he searched for them, that someone in the world above still remembered them enough to come looking. Days passed in that timeless realm where day and night held no meaning, where time itself seemed to flow differently. Dionysus questioned other shades, asking if they knew of a woman named Semele, a princess of Thebes, who had died in divine fire. Some had heard rumors, whispers of such a death, but none could direct him to her location. The underworld was vast, far larger than the mortal world, containing all who had ever died across all of time. But Dionysus was nothing if not persistent. And finally, after what felt like an eternity of searching, he found her. She was standing alone in a quiet corner of the asphodel meadows, her shade more translucent than most, suggesting she had been dead long enough for her memory to begin fading. But even in this diminished form, even reduced to a shadow of her former self, Dionysus recognized her. She had his eyes, or rather, he had hers, the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw. These were the features Zeus had described with such loving detail. "Mother," Dionysus said, his voice catching in his throat. The shade turned toward him, confusion in her dim features. She did not recognize him, of course. How could she? She had died while he was still unborn, had never had the chance to hold him, to know him, to watch him grow. To her, he was simply another mysterious figure in this realm of mysteries. "I am Dionysus," he said gently, "your son, the child you carried, the child you died protecting. I have come to bring you home. Understanding dawned slowly in Semele's shadowy eyes. Her son, the baby she had been carrying when she died, the child who had motivated every decision she made in those final months. He had survived. He had grown. He had become a god. And now he had come to the underworld itself to find her. Tears, insubstantial as morning mist, ran down her translucent cheeks. She reached out to touch him, and though her hand passed partially through his physical form, they both felt the connection, the bond between mother and child that even death could not completely sever. "You came for me," she whispered, her voice faint as wind through dry leaves. "Always," Dionysus replied. "I would search through 1,000 underworlds to find you. Now come. We have Hades' permission to leave. You're coming back with me, back to the light, back to life." He took her hand, or what passed for a hand, in her current form, and led her back through the underworld, retracing his steps toward the palace of Hades. The other shades watched them go, some with envy, some with hope, wondering if perhaps someone might come for them too, if perhaps they too might escape this gray existence. When they reached Hades' throne, the god of the dead examined them both with his ancient, knowing eyes. "You found her," he said, a note of what might have been approval in his voice. "Very well. I will honor my word. But understand this, Dionysus, the woman you take back, will not be the same as the woman who died. Death changes all it touches. She will carry the memory of the underworld with her, the knowledge of what lies beyond life. That is a burden few mortals bear willingly." "She will not remain mortal," Dionysus said firmly. "I intend to request that my father grant her immortality, elevate her to divine status. She has earned it through her suffering, through her sacrifice. She will become a goddess, and the memory of the underworld will simply be one more experience in an eternal existence." Hades nodded slowly. "Then take her, with my blessing. Persephone," he called to his wife, who had been watching the proceedings with interest. "Prepare the ritual of return." Persephone, who understood better than anyone what it meant to travel between worlds, who herself moved between the underworld and Olympus with the changing seasons, came forward with a golden cup filled with water from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. "If she drinks this," the queen of the dead explained, "she will forget her time here, will return to life with no memory of death's realm. Many who have been returned prefer this, prefer not to carry the weight of having seen what lies beyond. But Semele, even in her diminished shade form, shook her head. "I would remember," she said, her voice stronger now, more vital. "I would know what I survived, what I endured. I would carry the full weight of my existence, the joy and the suffering both. To forget would be to deny part of myself." Dionysus felt a surge of pride in his mother. Even death had not broken her spirit, had not diminished her essential courage. She was, he realized, very much like him. Stubborn, determined, willing to face harsh truths rather than retreat into comforting illusions. And so, without the waters of Lethe to smooth the transition, Persephone performed the ritual of return, speaking words of power that had been old when the world was young, calling Semele's shade back into solidity, back into life. It was a painful process. Dionysus watched as his mother's translucent form began to solidify, flesh forming over spectral bones, blood beginning to flow through reconstructed veins, breath entering newly reformed lungs. Semele gasped, as if surfacing from deep water, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with shock and wonder. She looked down at her hands and saw them solid, real, responsive to her will. She was alive again, truly alive, no longer a shade, but a living, breathing woman. The sensation was overwhelming, almost too much to process. She had grown accustomed to being insubstantial, to drifting without purpose through the gray lands of the dead. To suddenly have weight again, to feel hunger and thirst, to sense the beating of her own heart, these things were simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Dionysus supported her as she adjusted to her renewed physicality, his divine power lending her strength. "Easy," he murmured. "You've been dead a long time. Your body needs to remember how to be alive." When Semele could finally stand on her own, when the shock of resurrection had faded to manageable wonder, Dionysus led her to the path that would return them to the mortal world. Hades watched them go, his expression unreadable, thinking thoughts known only to the Lord of the dead. Persephone, however, smiled, pleased to see death reversed for once, pleased to witness a reunion that transcended the normal boundaries of existence. The journey back to the surface was faster than the descent had been. It was as if the underworld itself was eager to expel them, to return the living to the realm of life. When they finally emerged from the depths, stepping out of the swamp at Lerna into the bright sunlight of the mortal world, Semele collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the intensity of living sensation. The sun was so bright, it hurt her eyes. The air was so rich with scents, flowers, earth, her own sweat, that she felt intoxicated by it. The sound of birds singing was almost painful in its beauty. Dionysus knelt beside her, giving her time to adjust, to remember how to exist in a world of light and color and sensation. He understood what she was experiencing. Though he had never died, his dual birth had given him insights into transformation, into the shock of moving between different states of being. When Semele finally looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time, seeing him not as a savior in the underworld, but as her son in the world of life, her eyes filled with tears. "You're beautiful," she whispered. "You're so beautiful. I always knew you would be." They held each other there on the banks of the swamp, mother and son united for the first time. And for a while, nothing else in the world mattered. But Dionysus knew that Semele's return to life was not the end of the story. She was alive, yes, but she was still mortal, still vulnerable to injury and age, and eventually death again. That was unacceptable. She had died once already, had experienced the horror of the underworld, had earned her place among the immortals through suffering and sacrifice. Dionysus was determined that she would receive the recognition she deserved. He brought Semele to Olympus, that shining realm where the gods dwelt in eternal splendor. The other deities, sensing something unusual occurring, gathered to witness the arrival of this mortal woman brought back from death by a god who was still relatively new to his divine status. The air crackled with divine curiosity and, in some quarters, divine disapproval. Zeus, when he saw Semele alive again, felt emotions that surprised him with their intensity. He had mourned her for years, had carried the guilt of her death like a weight around his heart. To see her standing before him now, alive and vital, brought back memories of their time together, of the love they had shared, of the terrible moment when his true form had destroyed her. He moved toward her, almost involuntarily, drawn by feelings he thought he had buried with her ashes. "Semele," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "You're alive. How is this possible?" "Your son," she replied, gesturing to Dionysus, who stood beside her with quiet pride. "Our son. He went to the underworld and brought me back. He gave me a second chance at life." Zeus looked at Dionysus with new respect. The journey to the underworld and back was no small feat, even for a god. To do it out of love, out of a desire to honor one's mother, spoke to a character that Zeus recognized and admired. This was a god who understood loyalty, who valued family, who would go to extraordinary lengths for those he loved. But the reunion was interrupted by a voice that cut through the assembly like a knife. "So," Hera said, her tone glacial, "the little mortal who claimed to be Zeus's lover has returned. How convenient. Tell me, husband, do you plan to resume your affair? Should I prepare to be humiliated yet again?" The assembled gods fell silent. This was dangerous territory. Hera's wrath was legendary, and she was clearly displeased by Semele's resurrection. The tension in the air was palpable. Divine power crackling between the king and queen of the gods like static electricity before a storm. But Dionysus stepped forward, placing himself between Hera and his mother, his expression calm but determined. "Queen Hera," he said respectfully but firmly, "my mother has suffered enough for her connection to my father. She died because of the circumstances of their love, spent years in the underworld, and has now been brought back to life through great effort and divine permission. I am here not to restart an affair or cause trouble in your marriage, but to request that she be granted the status she deserves as the mother of a god." He turned to address all the assembled deities, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority. "My mother gave her life so that I could be born. She endured death with courage and dignity. She has returned from the underworld with memories intact, carrying knowledge that few mortals have possessed. She has proven herself worthy through suffering and sacrifice. I request formally that she be granted immortality and divine status, that she be recognized as a goddess and given a place in our pantheon." There was murmuring among the gods. Some were sympathetic to the request. Others, particularly those loyal to Hera, were opposed. The politics of Olympus were complex, and every decision could have far-reaching consequences. Zeus, recognizing that this was a moment that required decisive leadership, stepped forward. "The request has merit," he declared. "Semele is indeed the mother of a god, which makes her unique among mortals. Her death was a tragedy, born of circumstances beyond her control, and her resurrection demonstrates both her worthiness and the devotion she inspires in her son. I support the granting of divine status." Athena, goddess of wisdom, spoke up. "If we grant immortality to every mortal who has borne a god's child, we will have far too many deities. There must be some standard, some criterion, that makes this case exceptional. Apollo, god of prophecy and music, offered his perspective. The exceptional circumstance is not merely that she bore a god's child, but that she died as a direct result of divine actions and divine politics. Her death was caused by Hera's manipulation and Zeus's divine nature. In essence, the gods killed her. To grant her immortality is not merely a reward, but a form of justice, a way of making right a terrible wrong. The argument continued, with various gods offering opinions, citing precedents, raising concerns about what this might mean for future cases. Through it all, Semele stood silent, overwhelmed by the fact that gods were debating her fate, that her existence had become a matter of divine politics. Finally, Zeus raised his hand for silence. "Enough," he said. "I am king of the gods, and this decision falls to me. Semele will be granted immortality and divine status. However," he added, looking at Hera to acknowledge her concerns, "she will not retain the name Semele, which is associated with her mortal life and my affair. She will be reborn as a new goddess, with a new name and new identity. This will symbolize her transformation from mortal to divine, from Zeus's lover to simply the mother of Dionysus." This compromise seemed to satisfy most of the assembled deities. Hera, while not happy, recognized that Zeus was making an effort to respect her feelings by drawing a clear line between his past affair and the present reality. Semele would become a goddess, yes, but not as his consort or lover, simply as the mother of Dionysus. "What name shall she bear?" Athena asked. Dionysus spoke up immediately. "Thyone," he said. "It means the inspired one, the ecstatic one. It reflects her connection to my domains of divine inspiration and altered consciousness. It acknowledges her journey through death and return to life, which is itself a form of ecstasy, a going beyond normal boundaries." The name was approved, and the transformation began. Zeus himself performed the ritual, channeling his divine power into Semele's mortal form, rewriting her very essence at a fundamental level. Her cells, which had recently been reconstituted from death, now underwent another transformation, becoming immortal, incorruptible, eternal. Her consciousness expanded, gaining access to divine knowledge and perception. Her power grew, manifesting in ways that aligned with her new identity as goddess of divine frenzy and inspiration. The woman who had been Semele of Thebes, princess and priestess, no longer existed. In her place stood Thyone, goddess, immortal divine. She looked at her hands and saw them glowing with faint divine radiance. she felt the change in her perception, the way she could now sense the threads of fate, the currents of divine power that flowed through the universe. She was one of them now, one of the immortals, and would remain so for as long as the gods themselves endured. Dionysus embraced his mother, now truly his equal in divine status, and felt profound satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do. He had restored his mother to life and elevated her to the status she deserved. The tragedy of her death had not been erased. It still existed in memory, still shaped who both of them were. But it had been transcended, transformed into something more complex and meaningful. Thyone took up residence on Olympus, though she remained somewhat apart from the main political machinations of the gods. She became associated with her son's mysteries, appearing to his followers in moments of divine inspiration, blessing those who sought ecstatic communion with the divine. She was worshipped alongside Dionysus in his temples, honored as the mortal who had suffered death for love and been rewarded with immortality. Her relationship with Zeus was complicated. They were no longer lovers. That part of their lives was definitively over, ended by her death and transformation. But there remained between them a connection, a shared history that included both great joy and terrible tragedy. They were respectful to each other, occasionally friendly, but kept a careful distance to avoid antagonizing Hera or reviving old conflicts. With Hera, surprisingly, a kind of understanding eventually developed. The queen of the gods recognized that Thyone had not asked to be Zeus's lover, had not sought to undermine Hera's marriage, had in fact been manipulated and destroyed by forces beyond her control. While they would never be friends, they achieved a state of coexistence, a mutual respect born of acknowledging each other's suffering. But the true relationship that mattered, the one that gave Thyone's immortal existence its meaning and purpose, was with Dionysus. Mother and son became inseparable in their divine duties, working together to spread Dionysus's mysteries throughout the mortal world. They traveled together, appearing to worshippers, blessing festivals, teaching the ecstatic rites that would define Dionysian worship for millennia. Thyone taught her son about mortal perspectives, about what it meant to be human, vulnerable, capable of death. She shared with him the knowledge she had gained in the underworld, the understanding of mortality that only someone who had actually died could possess. This made Dionysus more compassionate toward mortals, more understanding of their fears and limitations, more patient with their failures. In return, Dionysus showed his mother the full scope of divine existence, taught her how to use her newfound powers, introduced her to the various realms and dimensions that existed beyond mortal perception. He took her to his secret places, the wild groves where satyrs danced and nymphs sang, the hidden valleys where reality bent according to different rules, the liminal spaces where mortals could touch the divine. The cults that worshipped them often paired mother and son together in their rites. Thyone became especially important to women worshippers who saw in her story a validation of their own suffering and a promise of transformation. She was proof that pain could lead to growth, that death was not the end, that even the most terrible circumstances could be transcended through love and determination. Her iconography in ancient art showed her crowned with ivy, holding a thyrsus, the ritual staff associated with Dionysian worship, surrounded by the same ecstatic imagery that characterized her son's depictions. But there was something in artistic representations of Thyone that distinguished her from other Dionysian figures, a certain depth in her eyes, a knowing expression that spoke of having witnessed things beyond mortal ken. Artists tried to capture the paradox of her nature, simultaneously joyful and sorrowful, celebrating life while remembering death. The story of Zeus and Semele, culminating in Semele's transformation into Thyone, became one of Greek mythology's most complex and meaningful tales. It was told at symposiums, reenacted in theatrical performances, contemplated by philosophers seeking to understand the relationship between mortal and divine. Different tellers emphasized different aspects. Some focused on the tragic romance between Zeus and Semele, others on Hera's cruel vengeance, still others on Dionysus's heroic journey to rescue his mother. But beneath all these interpretations lay certain universal themes that gave the story its enduring power. It was about the danger of seeking knowledge beyond human capacity, about the terrible price that could be paid for glimpsing divine truth. Semele's request to see Zeus in his true form was not evil or foolish in itself. It was a natural desire to know the truth about someone she loved. But some truths are too vast for mortal minds to contain. Some knowledge too powerful for human frames to bear. It was also about the complex nature of love between unequal partners. Zeus genuinely loved Semele, but that love was complicated by the vast difference in their natures. He could not fully be himself with her without destroying her. The disguise he wore was not merely deception, it was protection, a necessary barrier that allowed their relationship to exist at all. When that barrier was removed, tragedy became inevitable. The story explored themes of jealousy and vengeance through Hera's actions. Her response to Zeus's infidelity was disproportionate and cruel. Yet from her perspective, it was also somewhat understandable. She was a goddess whose entire identity was bound up in marriage and fidelity. And her husband serially violated those principles. Her vengeance on Semele and others like her was misplaced. The anger should have been directed at Zeus, but it was also a comprehensible response to continuous betrayal and humiliation. Through Dionysus's journey to the Underworld, the story became one of redemption and filial devotion. His rescue of Semele demonstrated that even divine tragedies could be addressed, that death itself was not necessarily final, that love and determination could overcome even the most fundamental boundaries of existence. It was a hopeful message in a mythology often characterized by inevitable fate and unchangeable doom. And through Semele's transformation into Thyone, the story offered the possibility of transcendence. Suffering was not meaningless if it led to growth and transformation. Death was not the end if it could be the gateway to rebirth. The mortal could become divine not through demanding it as a right, but through enduring trials with courage and grace, through being deemed worthy by those who had the power to grant such gifts. The cult of Thyone, while never as widespread as that of Dionysus himself, had particular significance in certain locations, especially in Thebes, where her mortal life had unfolded. There, local traditions preserved details about Semele that were not widely known elsewhere, stories about her childhood, her training as a priestess, her final days before the tragedy. Thebans felt a special connection to Thyone, seeing her as one of their own who had achieved the highest possible transformation. Women particularly were drawn to Thyone's story. In her, they saw themselves their vulnerability to forces beyond their control, their suffering in relationships where power was unequal, their capacity to endure and survive, and ultimately transform. Mothers especially honored Thyone, seeing in her the ultimate maternal sacrifice followed by reunion with her child. Her story validated their own struggles and offered hope that suffering could lead to something greater. The philosophical schools of ancient Greece found much to contemplate in the Zeus and Semele story. The Platonists saw in Semele's death a representation of the soul's inability to perceive pure forms directly without the intermediation of physical reality. The Stoics used the story to illustrate the importance of accepting natural limitations rather than demanding more than one's nature could sustain. The Epicureans pointed to it as an example of the dangers of seeking experiences beyond the bounds of moderate pleasure. Religious mystery cults, particularly those associated with Dionysus, incorporated the Semele-Thyone story into their initiation rites. Initiates were taught that they, like Semele, could undergo a kind of death and rebirth, could transform from their ordinary mortal selves into something elevated through contact with the divine. The ecstatic experiences central to Dionysian worship were understood as temporary glimpses of the kind of transformation Semele had undergone permanently. As Greek culture spread through conquest and trade, the story traveled with it. In Hellenistic Egypt, Thyone was sometimes identified with local goddesses of transformation and rebirth. In Rome, where Dionysus was known as Bacchus, Semele's story was retold in Latin poetry, most famously in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which emphasized the transformative aspects of her journey from mortal to goddess. The early Christians, seeking to distinguish their faith from pagan mythology, sometimes used the Semele story as an example of the dangers of pagan belief. They pointed out that seeking to see God directly, without proper reverence and understanding of human limitations, led to destruction. However, some Christian theologians also found parallels between Semele's story and Christian concepts of resurrection and transformation, seeing in her journey a pagan prefigurement of Christian mysteries. In the Renaissance, as classical learning experienced a revival, artists and writers returned to the Semele story with renewed interest. Painters depicted the moment of her death, trying to capture the terrible beauty of her destruction by divine fire. Sculptors carved images of Thyone crowned and triumphant, celebrating her ultimate apotheosis. Poets wrote elaborate verses exploring the psychological dimensions of her relationship with Zeus and her motivations for making her fatal request. Composers found inspiration in the story's dramatic elements. Handel's opera Semele, though it deviates from the classical sources in significant ways, captures the emotional complexity of the relationship and the tragedy of its conclusion. Later composers would return to the theme repeatedly, attracted by its combination of divine spectacle and human emotion. Modern retellings of the story have emphasized different aspects depending on the cultural moment. Feminist interpretations focus on Semele as a victim of male divine politics, destroyed by a powerful man's nature and a powerful woman's jealousy, with her own agency limited to making a choice between impossible options. These readings see her transformation into Thyone not as a happy ending, but as a kind of consolation prize, a way of compensating her for injustices she should never have had to endure. Psychological readings interpret the story as an allegory for the dangers of seeking to know too much about one's partner, of demanding complete transparency in relationships where some mystery and boundary keeping might be healthier. From this perspective, Semele's fatal curiosity represents the impulse to eliminate all distance and difference in intimate relationships. An impulse that paradoxically can destroy what it seeks to preserve. Literary scholars have analyzed the story's structure, noting how it combines multiple narrative patterns: the divine mortal romance, the jealous spouse, the miraculous birth, the hero's journey to the underworld, the transformation, or apotheosis. This combination of mythic elements gives the story a richness and complexity that has allowed it to remain relevant across wildly different cultural contexts. What makes the story of Zeus and Semele endure, what gives it power even in our modern, secular age, is its exploration of fundamental human experiences and questions. It addresses the desire to know truth completely, even when that truth might be dangerous. It explores the complications of love between people of vastly different power and status. It examines the price of jealousy and the cascading consequences of vengeance. It celebrates the possibility of redemption and transformation, even after the most devastating losses. The relationship between Zeus and Semele, brief as it was in mortal terms, changed the divine landscape forever. It brought into existence one of the most important gods in the Greek pantheon, Dionysus, whose worship would spread throughout the ancient world and whose influence would extend into Roman times and beyond. Without Semele's willingness to love Zeus, without her pregnancy and tragic death, without the extraordinary circumstances of Dionysus's birth, Greek religion and culture would have been fundamentally different. Dionysus himself never forgot what his mother had sacrificed for him. Throughout his myths and legends, he is repeatedly shown honoring her memory, defending her reputation, ensuring that she received the recognition she deserved. When her sisters, Semele's own siblings, spoke against her after her death, claiming she had lied about Zeus being her lover, Dionysus eventually punished them for their disrespect, driving them to madness. His vengeance was terrible, but reflected his absolute loyalty to his mother and his refusal to allow her name to be dishonored. The places associated with Semele became sacred in the ancient world. In Thebes, the site where her chamber had stood, where she had died in divine fire, was preserved as a holy location. Locals said that nothing would grow there, that the ground itself had been transformed by the divine energy that had consumed her. Pilgrims would visit the site, leaving offerings of wine and flowers, asking Thyone for blessings, seeking her intercession with her powerful son. The symbolism of Semele's story resonated across multiple dimensions of Greek religious thought. She represented the mortal who dared to reach for the divine and paid the ultimate price, yet was ultimately vindicated and elevated. She embodied the suffering mother whose sacrifice ensured her child's survival and success. She demonstrated the possibility of transformation, of becoming more than one was born to be, though the path to such transformation ran through fire and death. In the context of Dionysian worship, Semele Thyone took on additional layers of meaning. Dionysus was the god of wine, of intoxication, of the temporary dissolution of normal consciousness that allowed mortals to experience something beyond their everyday existence. His worship involved ecstatic dance, music, wine, and altered states of consciousness states in which the normal boundaries of self could be transcended, in which mortals could briefly touch something divine. Semele's story became a founding myth for these practices. She had attempted to see the divine directly and been destroyed by the experience. But through her destruction came creation, the birth of Dionysus, who would give mortals a safer way to approach the divine, through ritual intoxication rather than direct confrontation. The wine that his followers drank was, in a sense, a mediated version of divine radiance. It allowed them to glimpse what Semele had seen, to feel what she had felt, but in a controlled, survivable way. Thyone, as a goddess, presided over these transformative experiences. She understood what it meant to have one's consciousness radically altered, to die and be reborn, to lose one's former self and emerge as something new. She could guide initiates through the psychological and spiritual challenges of Dionysian worship, helping them navigate the dangerous territories of ecstasy and frenzy without being destroyed by them. The dual nature of Dionysian experience, joyful and terrifying, liberating and dangerous, reflected the dual nature of Semele's story. Her love for Zeus had brought her both the greatest happiness and the greatest suffering. Her death had been terrible, but it had led to something miraculous. The wine that brought joy could also bring destruction. The ecstasy that lifted the spirit could also shatter the mind. This paradox was central to Dionysian religion, and Semele Thyone embodied it perfectly. In artistic representations, the relationship between Zeus and Semele was depicted with varying degrees of tragedy and romance, depending on the period and the artist's intent. Some images showed the moment of her death, Zeus revealed in terrible glory, while Semele's mortal form burned away, emphasizing the tragic incompatibility between divine and mortal natures. Other depictions focused on happier moments, Zeus and Semele together in the garden, wrapped in each other's arms, celebrating the brief period when their love seemed possible and sustainable. Still other artworks showed Thyone in her divine form, often alongside Dionysus, both crowned with ivy, holding ritual staffs, surrounded by dancing Maenads and satyrs. These images emphasized not the tragedy, but the ultimate triumph, the transformation that transcended death, the happy ending that emerged from catastrophe. They suggested that suffering, no matter how terrible, could be the seed from which something beautiful would grow. The literary tradition surrounding Zeus and Semele evolved over centuries, with each generation of writers adding new details, emphasizing different themes, interpreting the story through the lens of their own cultural values. The earliest versions, preserved in fragments and references, were relatively simple divine seduction, mortal pregnancy, jealous divine spouse, tragic death, miraculous rescue of the child. But as Greek literature matured, so did the tellings of Semele's story. Later versions added psychological depth, exploring Semele's inner life, her doubts and desires, her relationship with her family, her religious devotion. These elaborated stories made her a fully realized character, rather than simply a plot device, giving her agency and complexity that earlier versions lacked. She became someone readers could identify with, could understand, could mourn when tragedy struck. The various interpretations of why Semele made her fatal request reveal the evolving sophistication of Greek thought about human motivation. Was it simple curiosity? Wounded pride? Legitimate desire to know the truth about her lover? Or was it, as some suggested, a kind of unconscious death wish, a recognition that her relationship with Zeus could never be sustained, and that destruction was inevitable? Different writers offered different answers, and the multiplicity of interpretations enriched the story, rather than fragmenting it. Philosophers used the Semele story to explore questions about the nature of knowledge and truth. Plato, in his discussions of the forms, suggested that mortals perceive reality through shadows and reflections, unable to perceive truth directly, because their nature was too limited to contain such perception. Semele's death when confronting Zeus's true form became, in philosophical discourse, an illustration of the limits of human knowledge, a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking to perceive what one's nature made it impossible to comprehend. The Stoics, with their emphasis on accepting natural limitations and living according to reason, saw Semele's request as an example of unreasonable desire, of demanding more than nature intended one to have. They argued that wisdom lay in understanding and accepting one's place in the cosmic order, and that Semele's tragedy stemmed from her refusal to accept the necessary boundaries between mortal and divine. Mystery religions, however, offered a different interpretation. They suggested that Semele's death was not a failure, but a necessary initiation. That to truly encounter the divine required the death of the mortal self. In this reading, Semele's destruction was not a tragedy to be lamented, but a transformation to be celebrated, the first step in her journey toward divinity. The pain was real, the suffering genuine, but it was also redemptive, purifying, transformative. This mystery religion interpretation influenced early Christian thought about death and resurrection more than early Christians would have liked to admit. The idea that death could be a gateway to divine status, that suffering could be redemptive, that transformation required the dissolution of the old self. These concepts appeared in both Dionysian mysteries and Christian theology. While Christians were careful to distinguish their beliefs from pagan mythology, the psychological and spiritual patterns were sometimes remarkably similar. As the centuries passed and the ancient world gave way to medieval Europe, the story of Zeus and Semele might have been lost like so many other myths, preserved only in fragmentary references. But the rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance brought these stories back into European consciousness. Scholars, artists, and writers, hungry for the wisdom and beauty of the classical world, seized upon myths like that of Semele, finding in them both aesthetic pleasure and moral instruction. Renaissance humanists saw in classical mythology a kind of universal truth expressed through culturally specific narratives. They interpreted the gods as personifications of natural forces or psychological realities, and myths as allegorical teachings about human nature and cosmic order. In this framework, Zeus represented divine power, or perhaps masculine authority. Hera represented female jealousy, or the binding force of social convention. And Semele represented mortal aspiration, or perhaps the soul seeking union with the divine. These allegorical readings allowed Christian Europeans to engage with pagan mythology without feeling they were betraying their faith. The stories became lessons about pride, about proper relationships between different orders of being, about the dangers of overreaching. Semele's fate could be compared to the Tower of Babel, another story about mortals seeking to rise above their station and being punished for their presumption. But alongside these moralizing interpretations, there remained an appreciation for the sheer dramatic power of the story. The romance between Zeus and Semele, the manipulation by Hera, the terrible moment of revelation, the rescue of the unborn child, Dionysus's heroic journey to recover his mother. These narrative elements had intrinsic appeal, regardless of what larger meanings might be extracted from them. Baroque composers and librettists were particularly drawn to the Semele story, seeing in it opportunities for spectacular stage effects and dramatic musical expression. Opera, with its combination of music, drama, and visual spectacle, was perfectly suited to conveying the emotional and supernatural dimensions of the myth. The burning of Semele could be staged with all the technical wizardry available to Baroque theater, creating a climactic moment of visual and musical intensity. The Romantic period brought new sensibilities to the interpretation of classical myths. Romantic artists and writers were less interested in moral lessons and more interested in emotional truth, in the exploration of passion and its consequences. For the Romantics, the Zeus Semele story became primarily a love story, a tragedy of passion destroyed by forces beyond the lover's control. Romantic interpretations emphasized Zeus's genuine love for Semele, his grief at her death, the genuine tragedy of their incompatibility. They portrayed Semele as a victim of circumstances rather than as someone being punished for overreaching. The romantic Semele was innocent, pure, destroyed by a combination of jealous cruelty and cosmic bad luck rather than by any fault of her own. This shift in interpretation reflected broader romantic values that celebrated intense emotion, that saw passionate love as inherently valuable even when it led to tragedy, that viewed social conventions and cosmic hierarchies as obstacles to authentic human connection rather than as necessary structures for maintaining order. The Victorian era brought yet another layer of interpretation, viewing the story through the lens of Victorian morality and social values. Victorian retellings often emphasized the dangers of illicit relationships, using Semele's fate as a warning about the consequences of extramarital affairs. These moralistic readings sometimes lost the complexity and ambiguity of the original myth, reducing it to a simple moral fable. However, Victorian classical scholarship also made important contributions to understanding the historical and religious contexts of the Semele myth. Researchers investigated the archaeological evidence for Dionysian worship, studied the mystery religions, and attempted to reconstruct what actual Greek religious practice might have been like. This scholarly work provided a foundation for more nuanced interpretations of the myths. The 20th century brought psychological and anthropological approaches to mythology. Psychoanalytic interpreters, following Freud and Jung, saw in myths like that of Semele expressions of universal psychological patterns. The story could be read as representing the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, with Zeus representing overwhelming unconscious forces and Semele representing the ego that cannot withstand direct confrontation with such forces. Jungian analysis might interpret Semele's transformation into Thyone as a process of individuation, the integration of opposite psychological forces, the death and rebirth of the self. Dionysus's rescue of his mother could represent the ego's recovery of lost or repressed aspects of the psyche, bringing them back from the unconscious darkness into conscious awareness. Anthropological approaches examined the myth in its cultural context, looking at how it functioned within Greek religious practice and social structure. Scholars studied the gender dynamics, the power relationships, the ways the story both reflected and reinforced certain social norms while potentially subverting others. Feminist scholars have offered particularly interesting readings of the Semele story, noting how it reflects patriarchal power structures while also providing a narrative of female suffering and ultimate triumph. Semele is victimized by male power in Zeus's divine nature and by female jealousy in Hera's machinations. Yet she ultimately achieves divine status through her son's devotion and determination. Her transformation from victim to goddess offers a narrative of female empowerment, though one achieved through suffering rather than through autonomous action. Contemporary retellings of the myth in novels, poetry, and other media often emphasize aspects that resonate with modern concerns. Some focus on the theme of unequal power in relationships, using the divine mortal romance as a metaphor for relationships where one partner has significantly more power, privilege, or status than the other. The destructive potential of such imbalances and the ways they can lead to tragedy, even when both parties have good intentions, speaks to modern conversations about power dynamics in relationships. Other modern versions emphasize environmental or cosmic themes, interpreting Zeus as representing natural forces that humans cannot control or fully comprehend. In these readings, Semele's request to see Zeus's true form becomes a metaphor for humanity's desire to fully understand nature, to penetrate all mysteries, a desire that can be dangerous when pursued without appropriate caution and respect for natural limits. The story's exploration of motherhood, particularly the sacrifices mothers make, and the bonds between mothers and children, remains powerfully relevant. Semele's willingness to carry her pregnancy even at great personal cost, Dionysus's determination to rescue and honor his mother, and their eventual reunion speak to timeless themes about family, love, and loyalty that transcend specific cultural contexts. In our current age, when questions about the nature of truth, the limits of knowledge, and the consequences of seeking forbidden information are particularly salient, the Semele story offers a narrative framework for thinking about these issues. What are we willing to risk to know the truth? What truths might be too dangerous or too vast for us to safely comprehend? When should we accept mystery and limitation? And when should we push against boundaries? These questions, raised by Semele's fatal request, remain urgently relevant. The myth also speaks to contemporary interest in transformation and reinvention, in the possibility of becoming something more than we were born to be. Semele's journey from mortal princess to divine Thyone represents a radical transformation that required going through destruction to reach renewal. This pattern, death and rebirth as a pathway to transcendence, appears in countless modern narratives about personal growth and change. As we near the end of this exploration, it's worth reflecting on what makes the story of Zeus and Semele so enduring, so capable of speaking to audiences across vast spans of time and culture. At its heart, the story is about love, in all its complexity and danger. It's about the desire to truly know another person, to see them as they really are, stripped of all pretense and protection. It's about the tragedy that can result when that desire meets realities that make such complete knowledge impossible or dangerous. The story is also about jealousy and its consequences, about how anger and the desire for revenge can destroy innocent people caught in conflicts not of their making. Hera's manipulation of Semele serves as a timeless warning about the cascading effects of vengeance, how striking back at those who have hurt us often creates new tragedies rather than providing satisfaction or justice. Through Dionysus's rescue of his mother, the story becomes one of redemption and filial devotion, demonstrating that even the most final seeming tragedies can be addressed through love, determination, and the willingness to journey into darkness to retrieve what has been lost. It's a story about refusing to accept that death is the end, about fighting for those we love even against impossible odds. And through Semele's ultimate transformation into Thyone, the story offers hope that suffering can be transcended, that pain can be the gateway to growth, that even the most devastating losses can ultimately lead to something meaningful and even beautiful. This is perhaps the most important message of all in an existence where suffering is inevitable. The possibility of transformation and redemption provides grounds for hope and continued effort. The cult sites dedicated to Thyone in the ancient world have long since crumbled. The rituals performed in her honor no longer practiced, the prayers offered to her no longer spoken. But the story endures, passed down through generations, retold and reinterpreted for new audiences, continuing to offer its complex mix of tragedy and triumph, warning and hope. In our own lives, we may never face the specific dilemma that Semele faced, may never need to choose between accepting mystery and demanding dangerous truth. But we all face smaller versions of these choices. We all negotiate relationships across power imbalances. We all deal with jealousy, our own and others. We all experience loss and must decide how to respond to it. We all wonder whether transformation is possible, whether we can become more than we currently are. The story of Zeus and Semele, through all its variations and interpretations, through all the centuries it has been told and retold, offers us a narrative framework for thinking about these universal human experiences. It reminds us that the answers are never simple, that love can be both wonderful and dangerous, that truth-seeking has its costs, that transformation requires sacrifice, but that even the darkest tragedies can give birth to something sacred. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can imagine ancient Thebes on a warm Mediterranean night, the smell of wine and incense in the air, the sound of distant music and laughter from a festival celebrating Dionysus and his mother Thyone. In temples throughout the city, priestesses pour libations and speak prayers, honoring the princess who became a goddess, the mortal woman who loved a god and paid the ultimate price, only to be rescued from death itself by the son she never got to hold. In the sacred precincts, the story is being told again, as it has been told countless times before, and will be told countless times again. The young listen with wide eyes, learning about the dangers of hubris and the power of redemption. The old listen with knowing nods, recognizing in Semele's journey echoes of their own experiences with love and loss and transformation. And the gods themselves, if they exist, if they are listening, perhaps smile to hear their stories still being told, still offering meaning to mortals who seek to understand the great mysteries of existence, love and death, suffering and transcendence, the eternal dance between the mortal and divine. Semele died in fire and was reborn as Thyone. Dionysus was born twice, first from his mother and then from his father. Their story is one of endings that become beginnings, of destruction that leads to creation, of love that transcends even death itself. It's a story that has survived for millennia because it speaks to something eternal in human experience, something that remains true regardless of how much our cultures and technologies change. And so we remember Semele, the princess of Thebes, who loved a god. We remember her joy in that love, her suffering in its consequences, her courage in facing death, and her ultimate triumph in achieving divinity. We remember Zeus's grief and Dionysus's determination. We remember Hera's jealousy and its terrible costs. We remember the whole tragic, beautiful, redemptive story. And in remembering, we honor not just characters from ancient myth, but the timeless human experiences they represent. If you enjoyed this journey through one of mythology's most profound love stories, please like this video and subscribe to Myths of the Night for more tales of romance, tragedy, and the eternal dance between mortals and gods. May your dreams be filled with ancient stories and timeless truths. Sleep well, and remember that even in the darkest moments, transformation and redemption remain possible. The story of Zeus and Semele reminds us that love between unequal partners is always complicated, that seeking truth can be dangerous, that jealousy destroys, but also that sacrifice can be redemptive, that loyalty endures beyond death, and that from the ashes of tragedy, something divine can emerge. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were when the story was first told thousands of years ago, and they will remain relevant as long as humans love, suffer, and hope for transformation. Good night, and may the stories of the ancient world bring you wisdom, comfort, and peace.